we come together to celebrate that we have come so far on this journey, and that capturing the stories of our individual and collective paths this is a beautiful opportunity to honor that. In that, I would really like to celebrate Mike. And I'm not sure that you know, Mike Kelly, who was a columnist for the World Herald for decades, has been such a friend to the Tri-Faith Initiative. He actually was the first recipient of our Bridge Builder Award. In true spirit of being a bridge builder, after last week's event, when I spoke about the gift that we had gotten from the Episcopal Diocese, Mike called me immediately after the session and said, "Why wasn't that in the World Herald?" And I said, "Well, we wrote a press release and we sent it in and we tried, but we didn't get traction on that." And he said, "I'll fix that." And he not only fixed it, he wrote the story and called the editor and got it published. So if you haven't had a chance to read that story, I just put it in the chat. And thank you, Mike, for continuing to be a friend of Tri-Faith, to help to spread our message. I get daily alerts whenever someone has said something about Tri-Faith, and wow, what a thrill to have the number of people who tweeted and posted that article that you wrote and said, "I'm so proud to be an Omahan because this exists here." And they tagged Visit Omaha, they tagged the Chamber, they tagged us, they tagged other faith institutions. So your words matter to us always, and your passion for the initiative is graciously received with love. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud to be an Omahan too, even though I'm living in Cincinnati now, hometown. But I'm very, very happy to get the story in, which really should have been in there. Very newsworthy, and you know I'm very proud of everything Tri-Faith has done. And so, but thank you.
So, Mike, if you get something from today's session, I think it's that I think you should write a book. And I think, if not the whole book, a chapter would be about the incredible trust and process that Countryside Community Church exhibited on their path to the Tri-Faith Initiative. I personally feel that it is one of the most glorious celebrations of humanity that the leaders of Countryside brought themselves, their passion, their calling in front of their congregation, and trusted that in a congregational church where decisions are made by many, not by one, that they could trust a process that could bring them to this initiative. And again, I believe that there's greater good here, and I'm sure we'll hear about those divine sparks today. But thank you to the leaders who have come to help us know more about that process. And I'm sure many of you, faces nodding, were part of that process. But I'd like to start with you, Eric. And I'm curious if you could tell us how you first heard that there might be an opportunity for Countryside to join this journey.
Sure, and if I could just back that up just slightly.
Sure.
That when I came to Omaha over 12 years ago, I had no idea such a thing existed, and the representatives of the Tri-Faith Initiative came to my church then to visit the new minister and make them aware of the Tri-Faith, and I was floored. I could not believe my luck to be in a town with such an initiative that could change the whole world. I mean. And I told them that, and I realized that the Tri-Faith Initiative would be locating just about 6 minutes from where Countryside Church was, and that if I were a member of Countryside, I'd want to leave Countryside and go be a part of that. And I literally told them, listen, if you guys get into trouble on this and need help, I am more than happy to help you gain. I would bleed 200 members off of my congregation in order to make this work, because this is way more important than anything that's being done by churches these days. And so it's kind of ironic to be sitting here, now. Yeah, I had I had actually been getting these weird intuitions for about a year before anything happened. I'd noticed that the Episcopal Church was, kind of struggling to put something together, and I just kept getting these feelings like, go pick up the phone, call the bishop, see what's up, or call REA, or or somebody. But I didn't want to stir anything up. I didn't, if things were fine, I didn't want to mess up the pot and to see. And so I just kind of shoved them down and thought they were extraneous. And then about a year later, I had heard that the Episcopal Church had reached out to the Lutherans saying, hey, we're in a bit of a trouble. And I thought, gosh, that's where those intuitions were. I should have picked up the down phone. But happily, I didn't need to, because Bishop Barker picked up the phone and called me shortly thereafter, just inviting me to meet with him and talk about things tri-faith. And so, I'd shared with him my own intuitive path on that, and we were kind of floored. And anyway, we didn't know at the time that could lead to anything other than, financial support or, partnership or something. But we decided, well, let's definitely have a conversation with the church and start the process of figuring out how we can help the tri-faith, because if you guys need help, we want to be there for you in whatever way possible, including trading places if necessary. But neither of us were sure if that would be necessary. So that's how the whole thing started. October of 2013, we formed a couple of groups at the church. One was called the Dream Team, and they were meant to just kind of help people meet other people in the tri-faith and dream dreams. And then we formed a committee called the kind of boringly named the Research Subgroup, which was meant to take any of the dreams and see what we could make of those dreams. And so that's how things started.
Thank you. Jen, let's hear from you. What's the first time you heard about it, the initiative, and feel free to weave in your role.
Sure. Well, so one of my very closest friends is Robin and Bob Freeman. So I know that Bob was instrumental in the embryonic stage of concept of tri-faith. And we were, I just was in love with the idea. And I was raised Episcopalian. I attended the Lutheran Church for a long time. And then, of course, I was a member at Countryside. And the irony is, Eric and I can crack up about this. I was in Whole Foods, and I'm like, why are we not in tri-faith? And so we were stuck over by like the pastry section. Remember that?
Yes.
And, I'm like, what is up? And so he's like, that's so funny. I've been meeting with Scott Barker. And the thing is, I went to preschool with Scott Barker. I mean, there were so many ties to what was going on and how I got to be so lucky where I am. And then, so that's where I heard about it. I was enamored with it, enamored. It was, I can't even tell you why. It was just, it made so much sense to me. And so I was asked to be the vice moderator elect, and that's the junior moderator, basically. And so I was the part of the Dream Team.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Rick, let's hear about your role and your first memories of hearing about this inspiration.
Yeah, right before we changed our moderator, so forth, in October, Eric called us to lunch, the three moderators, at Wilson and Washburn, and said he had something he wanted to bring up. So we're all sitting there, had no clue at all. And he brings this up and says, we've been approached. And my mouth goes, really? And so why would we do this? So there was some early discussion at that point in trying to determine, and after the first of the year is when we put together the research and dream team. Pam Craig was moderator, I was vice moderator, and as Jen said, she was vice moderator elect. So the three of us were quite tight in terms of this whole process along the way. And it was fun. We became great friends through this. But it was one of those things that we talked of how or what would be the right approach. And I think Chris Alexander, our associate minister, along with Eric, talked about doing a 40-day discernment process, but really look at whether this is something Countryside wanted to do, could do, and what, because we are a congregational church, what do the members think about this? And so we had a lot of home meetings and pros and cons and people that didn't want to do this and people that did want to do this. What was interesting is that while we didn't probably had to do some repairs or different things at our old location now, it wasn't like we were busting at the seams or the building was falling down. But what came out of that 40-day discernment, I think, was the fact that we learned so much about ourselves, the other two faith organizations, and looked forward to, where are we going to take Countryside? What is the next, for the future? It wasn't necessarily about the building itself until we really got into the whole process. And so as we went along the way, we did the discernment process, and then we had quite frankly, a heated discussion with the congregation as to whether we should look further in terms of what implications the cost and everything else would take to move us there. We did vote to do that, to at least look at it further. And so that was quite a process in itself.
Thank you. I guess I'll start with Eric, but 40 days discernment process. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, that was to me a really interesting thing. It was Chris Alexander's idea to do that, and so we created all kinds of learning opportunities. Kind of meet and greet opportunities with both the partner congregations. We had a lot of people were less familiar with Islam, so we did a intro to Islam class, and just all kinds. Anyway, we decided we were going to study this Tri-Faith Initiative from every single angle we could possibly think of and ask every question we could possibly think of, except for one. There was one question that was forbidden. Can you guess what question that would be? Those of you who don't know this story. How much would it cost? Because that's the surest way to cloud true spiritual discernment. Like if you think you could never afford it, then you're not really going to consider it. Or we also, if somebody were to come step forward and say, hey, I'll write a check for the whole thing tomorrow, if you just vote yes, you're not going to really do your discernment. So we were really trying to figure out, is it God's will? And in a congregational tradition, there is, for the last 300 years in the United States, there's been a practice of the best way to discern God's will is for the congregation to prayerfully look at this without any kind of obstruction, without kind of any manipulation, and just see what the Spirit does with the people. And then you get together, you deliberate, and you vote. And the majority gets it. It's not that we get God's will every time necessarily. We're all broken people, but we trust that decision more than we trust anyone else's decision, not a bishop or a pope or even a biblical piece. We trust that over everything else. And so our purpose was to just get out of the way and let the Spirit kind of work. In fact, I stepped out of the pulpit during that entire 40 days so that nobody would be kind of trying to read between the lines, asking, where is he trying to steer us? So the only time I ever commented as the senior minister was for 15 minutes in an optional session you could come to towards the end of the discernment process. And just the idea was just let it steep in people, let them experience it, let them pray about it, and see what happens.
Jen, can you tell us what that 40 days was like for you?
That was interesting because there was a lot of emotion on both sides, passion on both sides. And so it was fascinating to witness where people were, because you know we all have our own story about, well, of course this is perfect, and some people weren't there. And so of course dialing it back, and I was very prayerful. I just prayed a lot during that time, just to for the highest good. My prayer was for the highest good for this church, and for the highest good for all concerned was my prayer. It was my mantra. And so I would attend a lot of these, as I was support staff on most of it. And I would just sit and watch and smile and you know, witness a lots of fear, lots of excitement. And you know, it was, I think, one of the most important thing we could have ever done. And Chris and Eric and the team was so brilliant in how they laid it out, because we, you know, members of the church got to learn how our church works, and it's a congregational church. They are deciders. And two, the idea of letting the Spirit, letting you discern, the whole discern process in a very genuine, you know, beautiful way. And so so it was a very amazing experience. I felt during that whole time that my whole faith was blooming. Like I was blooming in my learning of the other faiths as well. And the friendships and challenges were important and beautiful gifts.
Thank you. I'd just like to say that I'm having a really hard time not saying, like, Deb McAllister, what do you think? Mark Stursma, what do you think? Because I know there's so many more stories here, but I'm going to hold the container and move to Rick and ask, and please know that over the course of the coming months, our intention is to invite all of you to realize that Tri-Faith is all of our stories, and that there will be opportunities for you in very short order to be able to share the magic of and the power of each of your individual stories, and that we need to and we want to capture those. So this is a beginning of a project. Of the next chapter of Tri-Faith is to celebrate that we each bring our unique stories to this process, and that they evolve each day. So Rick, this discernment process, the container that you created to trust that your congregation would vote about this decision, what did that mean for you? What are some of the profound pieces of that experience?
Well, I think like Jen said, I think my faith journey took a new path through this whole process. I remember going to a church council meeting, which is our church's board, to a retreat to discuss this. I can't remember, Eric, whether it was at the beginning of the discernment or we decided to do the discernment from that.
Yeah, that the latter.
Yeah, and so it was interesting because my wife was on one of the boards and was co-chair, so she went with me to the meeting, and on the way down she just kept saying, "I can't believe we're doing this. Why are we doing this?" You know, et cetera, et cetera. After that retreat, on the way back, why wouldn't we do this? This is for sure something we should be doing or looking at. And you're right. There was a lot of emotion, a lot of passion in the whole discernment 40 days. And I remember the meeting where we were going to decide after that 40 days what the next steps might be, and it had to come to a vote. And it was the vote to do a visioning that So what are all the implications? Now that we've looked at this discernment and studied it and whatever, and really got in depth of understanding both from the Jewish perspective, the Muslim perspective, the Christian perspective, everything. And so that vote was positive to take the next step to do that. And that was the visioning process, working with the architect firms of Alley Pointer, Maquetto here in Omaha, and HGA in Minneapolis, and see exactly what this would take, vision, cost, timing, implications to even move. And that process went from after the May discernment, May and June. It wasn't till next March that we brought that visioning report back to the congregation. At that time, I had moved into the moderator spot, and then Jen was vice moderator, and then Bruce Blanchard joined us on the team. But I remember that visioning process. It got more real. We looked at what kind of money that we needed to raise. Obviously, we had to have some lead gifts, and there was a lot of effort. We presented the visioning to the congregation actually a month before we were actually going to take a vote. So in other words, everybody had the opportunity to add input to this visioning process, discussion, and learning. And so it was fascinating in itself, and a real growth experience before we actually took the vote on April 12th, 2015. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will have to say, that was probably a highlight of my term, that being able to announce that we were going to join into the Tri-Faith Initiative on that day.
Well, we'll come back to that. Jen, I'm going to come over to you and ask this question that's posed by Mark Stursmus. Mark represents Countryside on the Tri-Faith Board, and he is asking, as initial proponents, how did you avoid letting your own bias affect the discernment process, and how difficult was that personally? Eric spoke to that a little bit, but.
Sure, yeah, and I'm glad you posted that. I was not perfect. I was not perfect on that, and I really struggled to try to be able to sit in the other person's shoes, pull out the Atticus Finch in me, and listen to what people had to say, and where they were in that discernment process. And I struggled. It was one of the hardest things I had to do, and kind of, I think I shared a book with you, sitting in the fire. It was a little of sitting in the fire, and sitting in the middle of the fire and trying to really be open to what was coming up for people, and how I was seeing things, and honoring both perspectives. So it was a huge learning experience for me. Thank you for that question, by the way.
Yeah, Rick or Eric, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I will say there were a few people who were very nasty and very rapidly going after people like Jen and myself and Rick and so forth. So it's hard to just kind of stand there and just take it all in and not, give any kind of feedback to that. But I do think that, the nature of the opposition, most people from the outside would assume, oh, that's because they're afraid they don't like the tri-faith idea itself. But that was not the nature of the vast preponderance of our opposition. Most people affirmed the principle of the tri-faith who were opposed to moving. They just didn't want to move. And in the history of American Christianity, it's extremely rare that a congregation ever moves solely because of a vision. Usually there's something else that is also a factor, like, yeah, your building's too small, or it's coming down on your, the roof's really expensive to fix, so it's cheaper to go elsewhere, or you're trying to chase a population on the growing edge of town. We had none of that. We had a great building we loved in a neighborhood that we loved and had served well, and they had served us well for 65 years. And so it's quite natural to have a sizable group of people say, why would you want us to pay $26 million to move from a neighborhood in a building we don't want to move from?
I agree to the fact that we did this, but I think while it was difficult, I was learning along the way as well, and so I found patience in the process, to not criticize. Everybody had an opinion. And a valid opinion, whether I thought it was important to me or not. Some people were attached to the building and the location. Some people were attached to other things and other reasons. So it was for me, it was patience and learning at the same time.
Thank you. Let's move to the question from Jeremy Fricke, who's our education director at Tri-Faith. I love how he posed this question. How do you feel the culture of your congregation has or has not changed since the decision to be a congregational partner of the Tri-Faith Initiative? Anybody want to go first?
I think I'll jump in there since, Eric, I'm sure has got an opinion and as well as Jen, but I think people became excited, more excited as we got moving into this whole process and building the new church. Nancy Blankford's on from HGA. They did a wonderful job of designing to our 8 aspirations. And creating a space that we can take into the future. And I think people saw that and see that. And so consequently, realizing that there are many more opportunities and programs that Countryside can do and is doing that excites people. I mean, there are people that would like to help and don't even know sometimes how they can get involved, and so it's a process as everything is.
I think congregations are kind of like ecosystems. They like a forest. A healthy forest needs a good brush fire about every 5 years to really clear out.
That's a good way.
And so this opportunity was kind of a big brush fire. And so what happened was, we did obviously have people leave us. We had 200 pledging households leave us as a result. And while I know others on this call still mourn the loss of some of those mightily, and it still stings some of those people, it was also a number of them were people who had never really been with the direction of the church for a long time, and were always pushing back over any little issue. And so what happened was we were left with a congregation that was basically, for all practical purposes, 100% or very close to it, aligned with the mission and direction of the ministry. And when that happens, it's like, oh my gosh, is that ever fun? and less time arguing, more time doing. And I think that also, kind of like alluding to what Rick said, is and underscoring it, when you kind of take a step out in faith, into this great unknown, and you're responding to a pure heart kind of call, and you discover that, oh my gosh, I actually could trust that call even though it seemed impossible, it gives you confidence. Like, okay, maybe I can trust that in other areas of my life too more and lean into that. And so I see the congregation acting actually a lot more confidently on all kinds of levels than it ever has before, not just on this one.
Good point.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah. I'm with Eric, although brush fire makes me twitch just because I'm in high fire danger. So I'd like to say cleansing. And I don't mean that in a mean way at all. It was this energy that that I felt with the congregation, and the movement was we were designing. We were going to look at different churches in Minneapolis, and we would come back and report this, and just it was such a joyous time. That was when I was moderator, was after the vote. And when I was moderator, we were kind of in the holding pattern because we were kind of in the building pattern. And so it was sort of just it was a calm time, which was, I was lucky for that. And we were just in moving, wrapping up our life on Pacific Street 8787 and preparing for our next, I don't know the address. So it was just this beautiful transition, when you're saying goodbye to something and handing it off to the people who are there now, with like a little baby bird. Please take good care of this lovely space that we have loved, and moving on to grow and evolve and become even more than what we could ever have imagined.
Thank you. David asks a great question next. Did you have any neutral professionals or volunteers involved to help through the discernment process or mediation from different viewpoints? If not, do you believe that might have helped some of the 200 stay? And if yes, how did they manage to build trust in the process? Eric, why don't you try that question first?
Mark, were you involved in that kind of mediation? I can't remember yet. You were, at least we were in conversation with you.
I don't know that I would call myself a professional, but it was interesting about being in the right place at the right time. I was in the middle of taking a facilitation class, and that's what prompted me to get involved. And so I know that I shared a number of those tools and cautions about how to be inclusive and not to alienate. I guess I don't recall if we hired anybody from outside the church, but in response to what Jen said earlier, I thought that the process was wonderfully done in a way that let everybody be honest, but focused on listening. And so I never felt like that even though we knew that their leadership was a proponent, there was always this fairness about it, but they were listening and they were going to honor the desire of the entire congregation.
Thank you.
Yeah,
perhaps we need to note the actual voting process in a congregational church is what? Can you make sure everyone is on the same page on that?
Go ahead, Eric.
You go. You know.
The congregation, the congregational church, instead of quote top down, it's bottom up. So the congregation makes the decisions, and our bylaws indicated that we had needed a certain amount of people present to vote one way or the other. And so we had over 70% of people attending the vote on April 12, 2015 that voted positive to do that. And so again, it's a congregational decision.
One vote per family, one vote per person. How old do you have to be to vote?
One vote per member of the church. So if my family were all there at the meeting, both my daughters and my wife and I, we would have 4 votes because we're all individual members. So it's individual. It's not a family unit vote.
And how old did you have to be to vote?
You had to be a member, so you had to be confirmed.
Yeah. So you could be as young as 8th grade. There wasn't a lot of 8th graders there, but you could be that young. And there's also no proxies. The idea is that you can't just simply decide on your own time and then send in a vote, but you need to be there for the deliberation. You need to hear what other people have arrived at in their prayer and discernment too, and be able to kind of work through that together. So there was quite a challenge to that no proxies thing that came up. And but ultimately, thank goodness, we landed on the historic congregational principle where you got to be there together.
Right. Yeah.
And we did have a sign-in process. We all people had to check in to get a ballot and to vote. So it had to all be verified. It was kind of arduous, but it was the right thing to make sure that the people that were voting with ballots were actual members of the church. So all those things were taken into consideration during the process. We did not have, by the way, an outside person facilitate the discernment. We created the discernment process within ourselves to discern this, and which I think was an advantage.
Thank you. Jen, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off. Did you have something? Go ahead.
Oh, I back to that discernment process. I'm fairly confident we also had people who were opposed, and we would allow for a discernment, to have the floor to host something so everybody could come and say why this wasn't a good idea. So it was really designed to be as fair as possible. Going back to we have, just a neutral person. So, yeah.
So I think it's important that we note, 200 people left for a reason. And this process, we know how the story ends, which is beautiful, but let's pause a little bit more in the fear and uncertainty piece. Lisa Lewis, who is on the Tri-Faith Board, also representing Temple Israel, is asking a question that I'll be honest, that I think reflects that as the Jewish community really struggled with fear around this decision. So can any of you express the particular fears your congregation had with joining a Jewish or a Muslim congregation? And if so, how did you overcome those fears, or how are you overcoming those fears? Could also be it's a process. Anyone want to jump in on that?
Jump in, Eric, first.
Well, we really didn't hear very much in terms of like being against the tri-faith or fear of, Jews or Muslims. I think when all is said and done, I think there was some kind of fear of Muslim settlement with some people. That's the less known religion, and that's why one of the reasons why we held the class on Intro to Islam. Just people, that's a very unfamiliar religion to most mainstream Christians, so there's some fear on that level. The biggest fear that we had to really confront was a very real one, and that had to do before we'd even made the decision to go into the discernment was, in terms of whatever partnership or lack thereof emerges, like if for a brief time we considered just simply going in all together, like making this a Lutheran Episcopal UCC kind of thing or something like that, and we realized that no, Countryside has an identity, and we could never just be the Church of the Tri-Faith, no longer Countryside Church. We need to be retain our identity as Countryside Church, and if we were going to lose our identity as Countryside, that probably would not be something supported by the congregation. So we did a lot of talks to try to see could we make some sort of thing work, and ultimately and tried a lot of different models that we worked through to see if we could have other partners there, and ultimately all three part of us, in terms of faith communities, Lutherans, Episcopalians, and Countryside Discernment, well, probably the best way to go forward would be to us and be as Countryside Church. And,
Thank you.
I think there was fear in some people that left. There was some fear in people that voted no, not to relocate, but have done a 180-degree turn. In fact, some of them who voted no actually were intimate in the process of working on the building and design of the new church. So, people left for various reasons, and a lot of them were unspoken, and so it was a choice, and you didn't sit and, why are you leaving? Why, we hated to see people go and still miss several people that were gone, but there's a lot of people that have joined because of what we do and are doing.
there was an outside group that deliberately tried to stoke fear in the congregation for sure, and they were really making a run at it before the votes. And they're a fundamentalist Christian organization that was committed to anti-Islam, especially sentiment, and they were putting the word out in the community, trying to warn everybody about the dangers. This is going to become Omaha would be a central place of terrorism. If we did this, nobody would be safe, that kind of thing. They, brought out there is a difficulty in Christianity itself. I mean, mainstream Christianity, not just the fringe, where there's a statement of Jesus quoted in the Gospel of John, which is the least historical of the Gospels, and nevertheless says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes unto the Father except through me," which a lot of Christians interpret to mean Christianity is the only way and there is no other path to it besides Christianity. And so there is a natural kind of like, what are we doing? In that, until you start to really dig into that passage and the meaning of that and so forth, where Jesus is really talking about a way of life that connects us to God, not a particular faith tradition. But that always, for any Christian, kind of gives a person pause, first, and then you get over that, and then you realize, oh no, these people seem to have the very way of life that Jesus was talking about, and so there's no problems here. But there is a vast, pervasive feeling when people are against interfaith dialogue. And you ask them why, or this kind of thing, they almost always quote that single line, no other line, but that. But that one. So there's fear around that too. And there was fear around, everybody had a friend who might be a fundamentalist Christian or what have you, saying, "What are you doing? Don't you know what Jesus said?" Or, all those things. You're leading people to hell by doing this. And, so those things. And we tried to address those things by talking about the scriptures and the idea of interfaith involvement.
So prior to this discernment process, Countryside had decades of the Center for Faith Studies as a prominent leader in interfaith dialogue in Omaha. How did you imagine the initiative would grow that idea? What did you dream the initiative would add to your congregation, to your personal experience, to the community? Jen, how about if you start?
I think the community is the key word on that one. The Center for Faith Studies was, I haven't been there for a while, so forgive me on that. However, it was just added, just enlarged what our message is, and being neighbors and being beautiful, good human beings to each other, regardless of which faith you belong to, and understanding that we didn't have a corner of truth. That was my biggest thing, is like, we don't have the corner of truth. We're we're just we're a part of that. We're a part of the big truth. And we don't know what the truth is, but this Center of Faith just made it even more magnanimous for our whole Omaha community. And I live in Colorado now, and I talk about this whole concept all the time because I'm involved with a church that lets the Muslim, there's not very few, and the Jewish faith worship there. And that's only the reason why I go there.
Thank you. How about you, Rick?
I don't know. I think I have to think back on the question, but
what were your dreams to take it from what you had as the Center for Faith Studies to what is becoming the Tri-Faith Initiative?
I think the Center for Faith Studies was a big stepping stone. I believe Cindy Kugler was kind of initiated that within our church, or at least led that at the beginning, because we're all Countryside's all about being inclusive, and this was one of those strategies or steps to educate and understand that inclusivity, so to speak. I think Tri-Faith is able to help take it even farther, and now that we're a part of Tri-Faith. But Countryside's not motto, but our all are welcome here. So it's a door opener for where this all can lead people, and provide that faith collaboration, or strengthens our own faith by actually continuing to do the same kinds of programs that can educate the public, celebrate the religious differences, I think is what we said. So
thank you. Eric, can you perhaps use the container of the 8 aspirations? In your congregation laid out expectations of itself. So how have those informed this next chapter as you've lived in this new space virtually at some points, but it's been a year or more now.
I'm embarrassed to say, you'll have to remind me what those 8 aspirations are.
So you can all work together. Rick mentioned them.
And the 8 aspirations were actually part of the building.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, okay.
And so it wasn't aspirations,
I see.
religiously, but it was, we wanted the building to be multifunctional. We wanted to be, we wanted it to be, we wanted to have views. We wanted it to be on budget. Those kinds of aspirations.
I misunderstood. Thank you for the clarity on that.
That's okay. And so, but it was part of aspirational ways of how we wanted to live.
Right. So I'll re-ask the question in how does the physical space of the building and the proximity to the partners help to live the dream for you?
Well, for me, there's, I've done a lot of study of Judaism and Islam, more Judaism than Islam in the past, but significant study in both fields, and have a PhD in the Hebrew scriptures. But there is no replacing actual lived experience to get to know a religion. It's fundamentally missing from your view of a religion until you start to see it up close and experience it up close, how it's lived, to actually show up and be so welcome at a Shabbat service or the Friday prayers at the mosque. I've for the better part of a year, I was making maybe 6-8 months, I was making a habit of going to each community as many, about 2 or 3 times a month to their worship services. And it's very eye-opening. And just to have that constant ability to see one another and to experience one another, to me is the biggest benefit. I mean, we could not possibly do, I mean, some people said, well, why don't we just do the Tri-Faith from where we are? I mean, we're only 6 minutes away. Why do we have to move there? But moving there has made all the difference. There's just no comparison, just the FaceTime aspect alone. And hopefully that, as REA constantly says, hopefully that will grow and grow and grow, that more people will feel like both buildings, the other partner buildings are open doors to them and to experience that, because it's quite magical. And for me personally, I'll just add just quickly that what that's done for me as a minister even is made me far more aware even of my own faith. As a lifelong Christian and as a serious student of Christianity, if you look out at your own scriptures with a Christian lens, but then add a Jewish and a Muslim lens over the same passages, it's like being at the optometrist office where the fuzzy, the letter you think might be a B turns out to be an E, and things become clearer and sharper and than ever before, and more nuanced, and you get to know your own faith and better and more deeply, and you get, even as you're getting to know the others more deeply and better. And I've found I'm more happy to be specifically a Christian than I ever have been in my whole life. But I'm also more deeply appreciative of Judaism and Islam than I ever been in my whole life too.
I think the other thing I'm seeing is it's nice to, come into our building and see members of the other congregations there, whether it's in our Common Grounds coffee shop, whether it's in a meeting room, whether it's in the sanctuary, whatever that might look like. We designed with Nancy Blankford's team, HGA Minneapolis, to create a building that allowed for relationship building as well. So kind of a crossroads of being able to create communication just by the physical structure of the building, which I think it has done, with one side being more educational and meetings and office and administration, the other side being more worship and fellowship and communication, and the center being where all those come to meet. So from
Thank you.
from the design aspect, that's where I fell in.
Wendy asked a question about whether or not all of the congregations are open for visiting, for worship. I'm assuming is the question. The answer in a non-COVID environment is yes. And in this reality, the mosque is open on a very limited, registered for space only for prayer for their congregants. And the other 3 buildings, it's my understanding, are waiting until the Douglas County numbers look more like under 5 new cases for a sustained period of 2 weeks, which heavy heart looks as if it could be some time. So in light of that, what I would tell you is that all 3 of the congregations have virtual worship, and we would encourage you to think about attending virtual worship. If that's something that feels that you're not ready to do alone, and that you would like to do that with a buddy, meaning to be matched up with someone from that congregation who might help you to feel comfortable in that experience, please reach my direction and I will help make that happen with you. And I know that all of the partner congregations are very invested in us making those opportunities and that openness continue, even as our buildings are not open. A couple things, I'm about to put a survey in the chat that I hope that you'll give us some feedback on what this experience has meant for you. And then I would like each of you as our panelists to have an opportunity to share anything that feels unsaid. So Jen, why don't we start with you?
Wow, I was looking at some of the questions that you kind of prompted us, and I think that when I first talked to Eric at Whole Foods and got to be a part of this amazing dream team, and we were so close, and then the visions for me really for the campus is big. I see it so big, and like bigger than it is now, like a stamp, and for the spiritual world as well as the secular world. And so that's what I really share. I mean, that's what I see. I see it, I feel it, and I'm so thankful, grateful to God that we could all be here and celebrate each other and our similarities in our learning areas of other people. So that's where I'm at.
Rick?
I think we've just touched the surface. You know, it took a while, several years, many years to put all this together. And I think there's so much more that can happen. But I think for me, going from being the lay leader of the church to chairing the building of the new church, to being involved with the Tri-Faith Board, I couldn't have imagined that at all prior to all this happening. So although again, a lot has happened, but we're just touching the surface, and there's so much more that can be done and so much more that is being planned. And I look forward to that.
Thank you.
And excited.
Eric?
I think that the tri-faith is kind of like, it's like with three children with the same parent. And that's what more and more it feels to me. And like each child has a distinct personality. You don't want the other child to be exactly like you, and they aren't. They're just intrinsically not. But you're all related. You can sense that relationship. And when we stop like fighting with each other or trying to say we're the only child, and or we're the apple of our parents' eye or whatever, and actually start to learn with each other and play with each other, we discover more and more about the parent. I think that right now that parent is calling all of the faiths of the world, not just the three Abrahamic faiths, but all of the faiths of the world to come together in various ways to meet some of the greatest existential challenges of our time, particularly climate change and the prospect of worldwide violence. That each of these faiths have amazing gifts that have been born out of thousands of years of discernment and practice to offer the world. And as long as we're fighting, we can't really offer those gifts very well or claim to be the only ones with them or what have you. But when we bring them together, and the more that, like Rick says, we're just scratching the surface, but the more that comes together, the more increasingly evident that we become, and the more powerful the force for good will become in the world, I think.
I think the advocacy of peaceful existence is, I think everyone is yearning for a little bit of that in their life.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. Please register for next week, where we'll talk a bit more about the site and the construction and the process of who those partners were along the way, a bit more practical pieces, but certainly such an important part of the journey. Thank you to Rick and to Eric and to Jen for your leadership in bringing Countryside into partnership with all of us. And it was just a wonderful hour. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye, Deb McAllister. Bye, Mark.
Good to see you, Mike Kelly.
Thank you.
By the way, congratulations, Jen.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Judy
great.
was supposed to be here, Jen.
I'm sorry.
I said Judy was supposed to be here.
Was miss you guys.